Hi, everybody. I have some slides to go through, but more important, please interrupt me as we're going through. If you want, if you don't understand something or you'd like to dive deeper into a particular area, or if you have a question, it's perfectly okay and recommended to interrupt me as I'm going through. And so if I miss, I can't see the chat. So if somebody chats, Diane, maybe you could just jump in and say, hey, Cable, we've got a question. That would be great.
Absolutely.
So I'll mostly talk about Creative Commons licensing. I'll talk about open education resources a little bit, but I'm going to have some broader conversations as well about why any of this is important and why we should care about it. Oh, whoops, I've got an old title here. I'm actually not the Director of Open Education. I'm the Director of Open Knowledge at Creative Commons. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm @cgreen, and I'll be happy to follow you back. All these slides, unless otherwise noted, are under a Creative Commons attribution license. And if you don't know what that means yet, don't worry. By the end of today's presentation, you will. So I always like to start with why are we doing this? Why do we care about open licensing? Why do we care about open education? Why do we care about sharing? Why do legal permissions matter on things that are freely available? And before we get into the details, and we will get into the details, I always like to start with this. These are the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I'm sure you've seen these before. These are the global grand challenges. These are the big complex issues of the day: poverty, hunger, gender equality, climate action, reduced inequalities, clean water. So these are all critical problems that every country in the world, for the most part, has and need collective action to solve them. One of the Sustainable Development Goals is SDG number 4, which is about education. And specifically, it says it is our job as a world to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifetime learning opportunities for all. And where does this come from? Why is this one of the SDGs? Well, if you go all the way back to the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and look at Article 26, it's very clear. The article says everyone has the right to an education. So that's my starting point in this conversation, is that everybody on the planet has a right to an education. And we should, as society, as organizations, as the academy, as governments, do everything in our power to make sure that everyone has access to effective quality education materials, learning opportunities, practices, and that we have the policies and the support mechanisms in place to make all of that possible. So this is why we do what we do. By the way, I should say I'm a long-term educator. I've been a professor. I've worked in United States universities. I've worked for US states. I've worked for community and technical colleges as well. So these are my people. You are my people. It's nice to be here. So what are some of the new tools that we have? Well, for about the last 22, 23 years, the world has been a very different place for education. First off, everything went digital. So right around the year 2000, give or take a few years, everything that we started to produce for education was born digital. So if you recall, before we had digital, we made analog things. We typed, we wrote, we used overhead, whatever they were called, transparencies, and we wrote on those and we broadcast them up on a screen. Right around 2000, we had computers and we had digital video and digital audio, and we had the means at more reasonable prices and more affordable prices to create things digitally. Digital is interesting because if you make something that's digital, you can make a perfect copy of it and there's no loss of quality. In fact, you can make 1 million or 1 billion perfect copies of the digital thing with no loss in quality. That was not something we could do with analog. Every time you made a copy of an analog thing, it got a little worse and a little worse. So digital has that characteristic. The other thing, and if you look at this slide, the cost of of handwriting something, when we moved to the printing press and then making digital copies, the cost changed dramatically. So yes, it's very expensive to create a new textbook, for example, and it is expensive to maintain that textbook. You need to keep it up to date. You need to make sure it's current and the information in it is current and relevant and adapted to the population that you're working with. But once you've made that book and paid those costs, you can make 10,000 or a million or more copies of that book for tens of thousandths of a cent. It's very, very inexpensive to do. So that's one thing that happened. Another thing that happened was the internet. So along comes the internet, and we can all of a sudden take these digital things and move them at near speeds of light around the planet. That was revolutionary. We'd never been able to do that in education before. So now we've got these digital things, education resources, that we can make a million or more copies of at near zero cost, and we can move them around the planet at very fast speeds. So all of a sudden, the supply chain problem, for the most part, went away. Yes, there are still digital divide issues in every country, and we need to pay attention to those, and we need better and faster internet, and we need devices for every student and every teacher and every educator. We're getting there. But largely in most countries, it's become affordable enough that those working in universities, those working in schools, have access to both the internet and to digital devices. And that's getting better and better each year. So this is great. We're like, hey, let's share educational resources. Let's do what education is supposed to be about, which is it's about sharing. So I used to be faculty at Ohio State University a long time ago. I don't know if you can tell, but I've got a lot of gray. I'm closing in on 50 years old. And I created digital things. I wanted to share them over the internet. But the problem was it was all rights reserved copyright. It was owned by the university. And so even though it was digital, even though I could make copies, even though the internet enabled me to share it, copyright said, no, others can't make a copy. Others can't redistribute it. Others can't adapt or modify it. So that's a problem. If you think about online, most of what we encounter online and much of what we use is free. And that's great, right? Free materials are fabulous, but open is not the same as free. Open is better than free. Open is free plus permissions. So when we say permissions, what do we mean by that? Well, we actually mean legal permissions. And in education, we mean something very specific. We mean these legal permissions. So we mean that everybody, when I say everybody, I mean the public, everybody in the world has the legal rights to retain a copy. So I can download the educational resource, I can make a copy, and I can keep it. That sounds obvious, but increasingly, many of the business models that we see from publishing industries do not let you keep a copy. They will lease you a copy. They may lend you a copy for a period of time. But the moment you stop being a student or stop being a faculty member or stop paying the lease fee or the licensing fee, you lose access to the copy. And they use digital rights management software to do that. Well, that's not what we want with educational resources. We actually want to retain a copy. We want to build libraries of educational resources as we encounter them over time. So that's permission number one, retain. Number two, but by the way, these, as you see, these all start with R. These are all commonly called the 5 R's. They were coined by somebody named David Wiley, who's a longtime open educator in the world. The second R is reuse. So I can download a copy and I can reuse that work exactly as it is. So maybe you are sharing a calculus textbook, or maybe you're sharing some, I don't know, biodiversity slide deck with me. I can download it, I can make a copy, retain it, and I can use it. I can use it with my students. I can revise it, so I can adapt, modify, improve it. Maybe it's in the wrong language. Maybe it was shared I don't know, it was shared in Mandarin, and I want to translate it into French. I have to have the legal rights to do that, because that, under copyright law, is making an adaptation to the work, and I have to have the permissions to do so. A remix, I might want to take something that you've shared from University of Malaysia, and I want to remix it with something I built, and maybe I want to remix in a course from MIT. because MIT shares all of their work openly under Creative Commons licenses. Well, that's called a remix. Think of it like you put everything in your mixer and you're mixing up a smoothie for breakfast. And then the last right is the right to redistribute. So maybe I took that work that was in Mandarin Chinese, I translated it into French, and now I want to share it. I want to share that translation. That's also a legal right that I need. These rights, retain, reuse, revise, remix, and redistribute, are prohibited by copyright law. So back to this slide here. Copyright forbids those activities unless you explicitly have the legal permissions to do so. And so there are a couple ways that you can get legal permissions to do this. One is copyright has expired and the work is in the public domain. So for most countries around the world, and this varies by country, but for most countries, copyright lasts the life of the author plus 70 years. Some countries are life plus 90, some countries are life plus 50. Mexico, I believe, is life plus 100. So nevertheless, if I want to share my work today, I'd rather not die first, have you wait 70 years, because I think most of us won't be around, right? Most of you won't be around in 70 years. And so that kind of defeats the purpose of sharing the resources. What we can do with open licensing is we can actually share immediately. So this is the UNESCO definition of open educational resources. Rather than reading through all this, I'll simplify it for you. Open educational resources is anything that you might use in an education setting that are either in the public domain or they're openly licensed. And it has to be an open license that allows you to make adaptations or changes to the work. And then you have to be able to share it with other people, have to be able to redistribute it. So it's freely available. You can make changes to it, and it's freely available. That's it. Those are open educational resources. And so, making that a little bit simpler than the definition, we're talking about no cost access. It's not behind a paywall, so you don't have to pay for access to it. It's CC licensed, using a license that allows adaptations, or it's in the public domain. I'll talk about the licenses in just a minute because there's different choices there. It's in any medium or format. So digital's really helpful, but it doesn't have to be digital for it to be an open education resource. In many education settings, printing the resource might make a lot of sense, or it might make sense to take it offline, a digital offline version, put it on a DVD or put it on a hard drive that's going to be on a mesh network and share it out somewhere where there isn't internet access. So when we share educational resources, we want to be thoughtful about this. And I know that Diane's going to talk later about accessibility. One of the accessibility topics that you want to think about when you're creating and sharing educational resources is to share in as many formats as you can, and particularly in editable file formats. You want to make it easy for somebody else to make an adaptation or a modification of the work. And wherever possible, share in open technical formats. So it's one thing if I give you a Word document, but now you're going to need Microsoft Word to open that, or something that can open Microsoft Word documents. It's probably better if I also give it to you as an ODT file or an open office file. And then with open educational resources, there's no embargo period, meaning, yes, it's freely available and openly licensed, but you can't have it for 12 months. I'm going to put a 12-month embargo on it. We don't want to do that. We want to say, here it is. It's available right now, immediately. You can download and use it. Okay, so we talked about the first two big tools of sharing. Number one, digital. Number two, internet. Then we talked about permissions, but what is it that gives you those permissions? Well, that's Creative Commons. This is where I work. You can find out more about us at creativecommons.org. We are a nonprofit organization. We're having our 20th birthday this year. We've been around since 2001, but the licenses came out in 2002. So yay, Creative Commons 20th birthday. We're celebrating this year. We create and steward and protect in court the open copyright licenses and the public domain tools that the world uses to share. We operate worldwide. The licenses work everywhere. And we have a global network in 85 plus countries, including in Malaysia and Australia. So we're all over the place. What does Creative Commons care about? Well, this is our vision. We seek to create a world where knowledge and culture are equitably shared in ways that serve the public interest. So when you think about Creative Commons, the first thing you think about are the licenses, right? So here are the 6 Creative Commons licenses and our 2 public domain tools. Our job is to build these, keep them up to date, teach people about them, enforce them in courts when CC licenses go to court, support the licenses in any way that we can. And that's what we've done for 20 years, and we'll continue to do that. I should be very clear, the licenses are free to use. There's no cost to use them. The licenses themselves have actually been dedicated to the public domain. So if our organization went away tomorrow, CC licenses are out there forever. So let me talk about the public domain tools first, and then we'll go to the licenses. The first one on the left is called CC0, or the public domain dedication. I mentioned that for works to go in the public domain, first I have to die, and then 70 years have to go by, and then my work goes into the public domain. If I want to give up my copyright today and put all of my work into the public domain, or some of my work into the public domain, I can do that using CC0. This is quite popular with museums around the world. So we just worked with the Smithsonian museums, and they dedicated about 2.83 million of their works into the public domain using CC0. CC0 is also very popular with data. Most data is not copyrightable in the first place, but some people try to imply ownership over copyright over data. So it's quite common that people will apply CC0 to big data sets in science and other academic literature to be very clear with the world that the data is in the public domain. The second public domain tool is called the public domain dedication. This is simply to essentially put a sticker or put a mark on works that are already in the public domain, so that people aren't fooled into thinking it's something that they have to pay for or that they have limited rights to. So when something's in the public domain, oftentimes they'll put the public domain mark on it. Okay, let's go to the licenses. The licenses essentially say, keep your copyright. So Dr. Fong is going to keep his copyright on his work, and he's going to add a license to give the public, all of us, some rights to his work. Not all of the rights to his work, but some of the rights to his work. So whereas copyright is all rights reserved, Creative Commons licenses are some rights reserved. So Dr. Fong retains his copyright, he keeps his ownership of the work, and he's sharing some permissions with the rest of us. And so it's kind of nice. You get both, right? I don't have to put my work into the public domain. I get to keep my copyright, and I can share the freedoms and the permissions that the license allows. Now, the cool thing about CC licenses is they're open copyright licenses. They sit on top of copyright. They don't negate copyright. They aren't against copyright. In fact, they work in parallel with copyright. The other neat thing about that is that the licenses are backed by the full force of copyright. So for example, if Dr. Fong shared his biology textbook under a Creative Commons license, and I don't give him attribution for that, that's actually not only a violation of the license, but it's also a violation of copyright law. And I'm liable under the penalties of violating his copyright. And so the licenses carry great force with them. And certainly the licenses are not about punitive damages. The licenses are about sharing. The licenses are about freedom. The licenses are about endowing others with rights to your work so that they can use it and improve on it and translate it into different languages and modify it to meet the needs of their students. So let's talk through the licenses. The licenses, as you can see, have these different options. So CC stands for Creative Commons. The by license, or the by attribution, means attribution or giving credit to somebody. So this book is by Cable Green. So you see that all of the licenses have the by condition on them. What that means is that if you use somebody else's Creative Commons licensed work, you have to give them credit. Now, for all of us in the Academy, that's okay. That's what we do, right? You use somebody's work, you give them credit. We give them attribution. If we don't do that, it's called plagiarism, and that's not something we do in universities or in schools. Right? That's punishable by getting fired or kicked out of societies. We just don't do that. If you're a student, you get a failing grade if you plagiarize something. And so attribution is easily understood by universities, colleges, and schools. The other conditions are optional. So SA means share alike, NC means non-commercial, and ND means no derivatives. So share alike means if you take my work and it has a share alike license on it, then any adaptations, any modified versions of my work must be licensed under the same terms as the original. So think Wikipedia article. All of Wikipedia is licensed under a by SA license. So if you go to Wikipedia and you modify the article, what you're agreeing to is that your modification will also be licensed CC by SA. Share alike is a way of essentially having the next person who does something to your work share it back with the commons under the same terms. NC is non-commercial. NC means you may use my work, but you may not use it primarily for commercial use. And ND is no derivatives. It means you can take my work, you can make changes for your own personal use, but you cannot share derivative works or adaptations with anybody else. So in education, we tend to stay away from the no derivatives licenses because educators change things. We just do. We see something and we say, that's really good, but I can make it better, or I don't quite like the order of it, or it's in the wrong language, or it's got the wrong example, and we modify things for our students. And that's good. We should do that. And so we tend to stay away from the no derivatives licenses. There are pros and cons to each of these licenses, and maybe we can dive into that a little bit in the Q&A period. So somebody be sure to ask me about that when we get there. CC licenses are perpetual, irrevocable permissions. So perpetual in the sense that the licenses last for the entire term of copyright. So if you put a CC license on a copyrighted work, the CC license is on that copyrighted work all the way for the person's life, all the way for the 70 years after they die, until the copyright expires and the work goes into the public domain. So that's great, right? We know that if we see something that's got a CC license on it, we can use it forever. And then they're also irrevocable, meaning the copyright holder cannot take it back. They can't remove the license later. Why do we care about that? Well, you might be building a new course, or you might be building a new degree program in the government or at your university or at a school. And if someone was able to reach into your course and say, I'm sorry, you can't use this CC licensed work anymore, and they took it out of your course, that would leave a big hole. And that's a problem, right? You don't want a Swiss cheese course that has big chunks missing in it. And so you can, with confidence, if you find a work that has a Creative Commons license, you can put it into your course or your degree program and you can use it forever. Nobody can take it away from you. So when we're talking about education and Creative Commons licenses, think about them in terms of sitting on this continuum. So most freedom at the top to least freedom at the bottom. And by freedom, what I mean is how many degrees of freedom, how much flexibility are we giving to other educators in the world? Public domain, obviously, the most free. You don't even have to provide attribution to works that are in the public domain legally, although we do, right? If we don't cite them, that's plagiarism, and we don't do that in the Academy. And so public domain is the most open. Then the CC BY license, where the only thing that's required is attribution, then by SA, then by NC, et cetera. The two at the bottom, as I mentioned before, those are not open education resource compliant licenses because they don't allow you to revise the work or to remix the work. And that's violating the permissions that we need for a work to be an open educational resource. So the licenses have a place, the ND licenses, but for education, we tend to stay away from those. So we very proudly say that we put the open in OER. We also put the open in open access publishing, and we put the open in lots of parts of open science and open data. And we're very proud of that at Creative Commons. There are a lot of CC licensed works. This is an old count, right around 2018. There were more than 2 billion works and those are only the works that are have machine readable licenses that we can see in a simple search. And so, is the number 4 billion, 5 billion? We don't actually know because we don't track that data. But CC licenses have become the global standard for sharing copyrighted works, and they're shared all over the world. So why do we care? Well, we said we cared because of Sustainable Development Goal number 4, and that education is a human right. And that's good. We should care about that. But let's talk a little bit about specifically, why do you care as educators? Why should your universities care? Why should your government care? Well, the first thing, and this goes to your inclusive OER policy, it increases equity. So when you're using OER, when the resources are free and when they're openly licensed so they can be modified, all of your students have access to quality learning materials that have the most up-to-date and relevant content, because of course OER is openly licensed. It can be copied, it can be modified, it can be distributed. You can share them in advance of the course starting. I don't know about Malaysia, but in my country, in the United States, it's quite common that with students at university have their financial aid, and they oftentimes don't get their financial aid money until 2 weeks after the course has started. And then they can afford to go buy their educational resources, their textbooks and other materials. And by then they're behind in the class, and either they do poorly in the class or sometimes they just quit because they're so far behind. And that's who has money and who doesn't have money. So that's not equitable. When we move courses to OER, everybody gets all of the materials on day one. I have a colleague who likes to say students can't learn with materials that they can't afford. Closely aligned with that is saving money. So of course, when you use OER, your students don't have to spend money on the textbook or on other materials. And there are costs, lots of costs of attending an education. We have transportation costs and food and housing and tuition and all these other costs. When you don't have to pay for the educational resources, you can spend those costs in other areas. Keeping the content relevant, effective, and high quality. So I don't know what your experience is, but my experience teaching here in the US is that our traditional textbooks are perpetually out of date. Why is that? Well, because by the time they're published, they're usually 2 or 3 years out of date already. And then in some, oftentimes textbooks are reused for many years. So we have, our oldest son is in high school, and he went into his junior year and he was given a political science textbook, and the copyright date was, I believe it was 2002. So here's this book he has that's 20 years old for political science. Has anything interesting happened in political science, in politics, in government in the last 20 years? Yeah, I think so. And so is that okay that we're giving students, materials that are so outdated? I would argue no, that we should be ashamed of that, and that we should do better, and we should share those resources. So of course, if something is CC licensed or it's in the public domain, educators can update the content. We can modify it. We can continuously update it. This is probably my favorite reason to move to open education resources, and that is that it's empowering to both faculty and to students or learners. Why is it empowering? Well, because it honors faculty as creative professionals that they are. It gives them the legal permissions to adapt and customize the learning materials to meet the learning goals for their students where they teach and where the education settings are without breaking any copyright laws. So, my doctorate is in education psychology. I'd be more than happy to share you my education psychology materials, but they're probably, maybe you don't want them in English. Maybe you want to translate them. Maybe you look at the examples that I've used and you say, yeah, they're okay, but they're not really the examples we want to use with our students. We want different examples. I learned this firsthand. I was working with the community and technical colleges in my state, and I went down to Brazil to share. I was in Sao Paulo, Brazil, sharing what we were working on. We took our entire curriculum and we moved it to open education resources. And I had a meeting with the Brazilian leaders of the community colleges in Brazil. And I said, they said, could we have a copy? And I said, of course, not only can you have a copy, you don't have to ask, it's CC licensed, you can just download it. And I said, I'm just curious, what will you do with the resources? And they said, well, we're in Brazil, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to translate it into Portuguese, and we'll very likely translate it into Spanish as well, because we have a lot of students from around Latin America who come and study at our universities and at our colleges. And they said, no disrespect, but we're going to fix the errors in it. And I said, what do you mean fix the errors? And they said, well, settle down. This is version 1. You surely have some errors in the work, and we'll find them. We'll fix them. And then we'll give you back a copy with your fixed curriculum. And I said, well, yeah, you're probably right. And then they said, we're going to look at your biology courses. And because this was made in Washington State, you probably have examples about pine trees and bears and salmon and, creatures and fauna that are in Washington State, but they don't make any sense in Brazil. In Brazil, we would use examples from the Amazonian rainforest, and we'd use examples that are local, not from the United States. And I said, that's great, right? And so this was about them having the legal rights to empower their faculty, their instructional designers, their librarians to actually take what we had produced as a first draft and make it better, but most importantly, make it appropriate for their learning spaces. Okay, let me shift gears back to where I started with the Sustainable Development Goals. At Creative Commons, this is kind of one of our grand narratives. We're talking a lot about better sharing right now. And when we think about what we want to spend our time on at Creative Commons, what we're really interested in is looking at the big problems in the world. And we're talking about how if you want to solve those big problems, that knowledge about those problems must be shared openly with everybody if we're going to solve them. If you don't open the knowledge about big problems, your chances of solving them goes down significantly. We also acknowledge that access to open knowledge is a necessary but not sufficient condition to solving these big complex problems. So you want to work on climate change? We would argue all of the research, all of the data, all the educational resources need to be open in the public domain or CC licensed. Is that enough to solve climate change? No. Is it a necessary condition to solving climate change? Yes. If the world can't access knowledge about climate change, how are we supposed to work on it, right? So we think this is a fairly obvious argument. And as we showed at the beginning, we've got multiple big complex problems. And here they are again, right? These are huge. How are we going to develop sustainable communities? How are we going to have peace and justice and strong institutions in our countries? How are we going to have responsible consumption and production so that we can dial back the negative effect that humans are having on climate change and on our oceans and on land? How are we going to feed all of our people to make sure that nobody goes hungry? How are we going to reduce inequalities for all people? Right? These are hard, big, complex problems to work on. Knowledge about them must be open, and it's not just the open educational resources about them, although that's important. It's the OA research. Yes, it's the OER, but it's also the practices, the open practices which go with our education settings. That's a whole nother different talk. It's the data that we have about climate change. It's the open science and the sharing community around that. It's the open policies that support all of open knowledge, the funding of it, et cetera. I mentioned with what open educational resources are about when we're looking at open access research, this is what we need. We need no cost access to research, no paywalls, CC BY on the articles so that those articles can be text and data mined, CC 0 on the data so that there's no question about its copyright status, and no embargo, period. The open educational resources, we already talked about this, right? CC license, no ND licenses in multiple formats, editable file formats, no embargo period, freely available, openly licensed. Now, the good news is for both education and science, we've got some new opportunities. One is UNESCO in 2019 passed what's called the UNESCO recommendation on open education resources. This was unanimously passed at the 40th UNESCO General Conference. If you haven't seen this document, please take a look at it. We were having a conversation before. Creative Commons is actively involved in building materials that will all be CC BY licensed for governments to start to implement the recommendation. We're also providing direct consulting services for governments. So we'd very much like to work with your government in Malaysia. So if any of you have connections with the Ministry of Education, please do let me know. We're eager to provide our services and help the government think through what implementation looks like and where it might like to start. And so why is this a big deal? Well, it's a big deal because UNESCO recommendations are official instruments that give national governments a very specific list of actions to take to support open education in their countries and to collaborate with other nations as they're doing so. Just last November at the 41st General Conference of UNESCO, again, unanimous passage of a UNESCO recommendation, but this time on open science. If you haven't taken a look at this, you should do. It's an excellent second recommendation about open knowledge, which just came out of UNESCO. So these international frameworks provide a unique opportunity for us as educators, as researchers, as scientists to advance open education and open science around the world. Why are they a big deal? Because when you work with national governments, you get scaled impact. National governments have the highest level of policy that affects what we do. National governments have the money. Yes, foundations have a lot of money, but they don't have anything close to what national governments have. And one of the many actions in both these recommendations is to change the rules on the money around education resources and around science and in particular scientific research. And the core idea, and Creative Commons helped write both of these recommendations with international coalitions. One of the core ideas that's in both of these recommendations is that publicly funded resources should be openly licensed by default. When the Malaysian public pays taxes to the government and the Malaysian government funds research, that research should be open. When the Malaysian government funds education resources to be built or revised, those resources should be openly licensed or put into the public domain. This is one of my favorite projects around this idea. This comes out of Norway, partners with the United Nations on this as well, and others. Creative Commons is a partner in this. And we're talking about digital public goods. So this is very much kind of, you've heard me talk about this already, right? When we can make something digital, we can share it online, and it's openly licensed. That's the trifecta. So the Digital Public Goods Alliance is talking about what is it that countries could benefit from that could be digital and openly licensed? Well, it's a lot of things, right? It's open source software, it's open educational resources, it's open access research, it's open scientific literature. It's the software that controls the stoplights in the middle of Kuala Lumpur that might also be useful in Uganda, which might also be useful in Nigeria and in Seattle, Washington, because Shanghai came up with a really great algorithm that moves traffic better than it did before. We can make that a digital public good that gets openly licensed and gets shared. Just last fall, we had our big climate change conference in Glasgow, Scotland. The world came together, talked about climate change. Here it is on our list of United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. But guess what? Climate change doesn't stand alone. Climate change is interlinked with pretty much every other SDG. Do you think individual people who are hungry and living in poverty are going to care about climate change? Probably not, right? Are uneducated people going to care as much and be able to act on climate change if they don't have SDG 4? No, I would argue. If there are significant inequalities in wealth and access to resources, are people with are suffering on the low end of inequalities going to pay attention to climate change? Odds are not as much, right? All of these things are interlinked. We can't just focus on one. We have to focus on all of them. And so this is where I come back, right? It's open knowledge is, think of it as infrastructure to solving these big problems. I'm wrapping up now. We are trying to walk the talk. And one of the things that we're doing right now is we launched a campaign to make all of the open knowledge about climate and biodiversity open. So we're focusing on the research, the academic research and the data about climate and biodiversity, but we'll also be looking to open up education resources, software, open hardware around climate and biodiversity, in addition to the research. So we're very excited about this. We just hired a campaign manager. She starts shortly, and we're eager to get moving on this project. So I thank you for your attention and your time. Let's work together to solve big problems, and we can start by sharing our work openly. A couple quick plugs, and I'll share these links in the chat. If you want to learn more about this at a much deeper level, we have something called the CC certificates. This is it's a 10-week online course. At the end of it, you get a credential from Creative Commons. This is you will become I guarantee, the Creative Commons public domain and copyright expert at your institution if you are CC certified. There is another option. We can set up custom 1-week intensive certificates for your institution. And you can invite lots of people to come to that, or we can create custom training opportunities for you. Another invitation is to join the Creative Commons Open Education platform. There's no cost to join. There's no membership fee or anything. You can just join, and I'll share this link as well. This is about 11, not quite that much. It's just over 1,000 people from 93 countries around the world are part of this. And we get together every month, and we talk about how we can create open education projects and services that the world needs. So that's a lot of fun. Here's my contact information. Again, there's my Twitter handle, and there's my email. I'm cable@creativecommons.org. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'll share a few links here, and then we can jump right to the Q&A.
Thank you so much. Very appreciative. That was an excellent overview of Creative Commons. I hope everybody got a lot out of that. So I do have a question for you. Ooh, if I can get back to my thing. Let's have a look. So this is a double question from Professor Fong. He wants to know, how does Creative Commons disrupt conventional publishers? Are there any court cases and outcomes from that?
Yes. So as you might imagine, I'm not the most favorite person of traditional publishers, right? We're out there advocating that knowledge should be shared freely, and what they want to do is to have you pay for educational resources. And so that being said, we work with the big publishers, and we try to help them open up some of their resources, and they've done that to an extent. But to be fair, we're a nonprofit, and our mission is to help people share, and they're for-profits, and their mission is to make a profit for their shareholders, and that's okay. But we just have different goals. One example of a court case happened recently in the United States. So I mentioned open licensing policies that governments are starting to deploy. So the United States Department of Education, we worked with them and helped them adopt what they call their open licensing rule. And the open licensing rule at the US Department of Education says if you take grant money or contract money from them, this is public funds, this is taxpayer money. If you take money from them, whatever you build, the products of the grant must be openly licensed, and they recommend the CC BY license. So money goes out. One example of this is actually before the open licensing rule. The New York State received a bunch of money to support the K-12 schools. So this is like primary education. They took $40 million US, New York State did, and they put out RFPs, or requests for proposal, or a tender, into the marketplace. And they said, we would like to build new educational resources, mostly in math and English language arts, writing and reading. Those grants went out, and the copyright was held by the publishers, and then the publishers put Creative Commons licenses on that work. On the license they chose was the CC BY NCSA, or the non-commercial share alike license. So this is a fairly restrictive license. Let me pause for a minute just to say our advice to New York State was that New York State, or the government, should have kept the copyright. They should have made the publishers work for hire. They should have paid them a lot of money, They had $40 million, right? They should have paid the publisher to build what New York State needed and wanted, and that's good. But New York State should have kept the ownership because they paid for it. And then New York State should have put a CC BY license on it, and then there wouldn't have been any problems. That's not what happened. What happened was New York State let the publishers have copyright. The publishers chose a very restrictive Creative Commons license. Okay, so that's what happens. These, by the way, this project is called the, what was it called? Engage New York. So if you go to your favorite search engine and type in Engage New York, you'll find this project. It was immensely popular. There were studies done. Over 85% of the schools in the United States were using this material. It was all free. It was all OER, right? Big win in education, big win for open education. Well, it was so popular that the schools in the United States, especially the big school districts, they didn't have one-to-one computer programs for their students. So many of their students did not have computers at school. Many of their students did not have internet or computers at home. And so the school districts, big school districts, would go to printing shops to print copies of the OER, which of course is completely okay. You can print CC license works, that's okay. So they made it available digitally and they gave it to the students in print. It was an accessibility issue. It was an equity issue. It was a good thing to do. Well, the publishers who owned the copyright and had an NC license, a non-commercial license, the publishers said, no, you may not do that because you're going into Kinko's, FedEx Kinko's, or you're going into Office Depot. These are big stores in the United States where you can print 1,000, 2,000 copies of something. You give them the thumb drive and you come back the next day and they'll give you 2,000 copies of whatever you wanted printed. And, that's a commercial activity. So the publishers were saying that the printers were violating the Creative Commons license and they sued them in court. And these went all the way up to very high level courts in the United States. Creative Commons said, no. The licensor, I'm sorry, the licensee is not the printer. The licensee is the person using the license, the entity that is exercising the rights in the license. It is not Kinko's or Office Depot, the printers. It is the schools. The schools are using the license. They're merely using an external printer to exercise the school's rights that are in the Creative Commons license. And so we went to court and we filed what are called amicus briefs, where it's like a friend of the court brief. And we said, no, this is how the licenses work. The schools are not making commercial use of these NC works. The schools are making non-commercial use of these works, and the courts agreed. The publishers were not happy. The schools were happy. So on the one hand, it was a big win, and I'll be happy to share a link to all this if you want to see. On the one hand, it was a big win, but I actually viewed it as two big losses. The first loss was that it was a bad open policy at New York State, right? If they would have kept the copyright and put a CC BY license on it, there would have been no lawsuit. The bigger loss was that for about 12 months, the schools in the United States were afraid, fearful of printing this OER because there was a big court case, and education institutions tend to be very risk averse, especially of lawsuits, because we can't afford lawsuits, right? And so that made me very sad, because here was, a policy had not been done well, and the net result was about 12 months of severe underuse of these educational resources. There's also a big fight right now with the publishers. It's called, I'll give you the link here. It's called Inclusive Access. And so here is the website that Spark is another group that works in this space in open education and open access. They're leading it. And what inclusive access is, well, I should back up a step. So, and then we'll go to somebody else's question. So the publishers were losing market share to OER. So you may be familiar with OpenStax.
Mhm.
Let me share the link to OpenStax here. So this is a project.
We're going
where
into it. We're going into it on Friday. So,
oh, good, good.
yeah.
So OpenStax builds very high quality textbooks that are OER and they're CC BY licensed. They have just in North America saved students over $1 billion, 1 billion US dollars. That's $1 billion that would have gone into the pockets of big publishers. So the publishers are not happy about OER. And you know what? That's okay. That's not our problem. Our problem is to do SDG 4. That's our job and your job. And so include what the publishers started to do, and if they may be doing this in Malaysia and Australia as well, but they're starting to go to the universities and they're saying, we know that educational resources are very expensive. Good news, if you sign an exclusive deal with us, the publishers, and you promise to use our materials, we'll give you a 30% discount. We'll bundle the cost of the books into tuition. So now that you can tell your students they get free books, but they're not really free. We're just bundling it into the cost of tuition. So the students' tuition goes up. And because you've already paid, or the students have already paid for the books, you don't need to use OER anymore because you have access to all of our books for free, quote unquote free. And so that's called inclusive access. And so this website is exposing that and giving information about that. And so just beware, if this business model is not already in your country, it's coming to your country.
Yes,
Those
I haven't heard of that one, so that would be interesting to keep an eye out for. And I think the consideration of what type of license to use will come very handy when we're actually developing our own inclusive open education resources. So thank you. A second question for you was, can you describe the importance of Creative Commons in this era of COVID and wartime?
Wow, those are great questions. And by the way, I'm dropping links in that
Yes.
I shared in the slide, so feel free to use any of those if they're helpful. Yeah, so let's start with COVID. There was a real push as COVID was getting worse for all of the research and the research data to be opened around COVID. That was very successful. The publishers didn't want to open those materials. They wanted to keep them behind a paywall, but there was a big push by the world's governments to the publishers to say, look, right now, we have to get this knowledge out there so that as many people as possible can look at this research. This is urgent. You need to open up the research at least for a short period of time before it goes back behind a paywall. That's good, but I would argue, are any of the other SDGs urgent? I mean, is it urgent that we work on climate change? I think so. Is it urgent that we care about educational resources for the world's learners? I think so. Is it urgent that we look at gender inequality in the workplace in countries and pay attention to that issue and open up the research about that and the educational resources about that? Yeah, I think it is. And so, yes, COVID is urgent, but so are all of these other things. And so if it's true that we should open up the research about COVID and governments care a lot about that, how do we get governments to also care about the rest of the SDGs? And I think that's the challenge in front of us. So yes, that was one thing that happened with COVID. Wartime, well, let me use what's in front of us right now. I'll use the Ukraine right now. And not so I don't even have to use Ukraine. Let me use Syria as an example. So as Syria entered its war, it's been in a state of conflict for a long time now. Several million Syrian citizens, including educators and many students, were forced to flee their country. Many of them went to Turkey and then went to other European nations and countries around the world. As students left Syria and went to these other countries, they were encountering education systems that were unfamiliar to them, educational resources that were not in their language, education resources that were not, didn't acknowledge or use examples from their culture. And it was, it was already horrible enough to be a refugee and be forced out of your homes. And now you're put back into school in a different country with materials that are not in your language and don't acknowledge where you come from. And it was a very difficult situation and continues to be for refugees, not just from Syria, but all around the world. And so one of the things we're looking at right now with Ukrainian refugees, but also other refugees around the world, when I say we, I mean Creative Commons, Learning Equality is an organization, various United Nations, especially UNHCR, NORAD out of Norway, and others have engaged in these conversations and trying to think about how can open educational resources be shared so that they can be translated and modified to meet the needs of learners. Can the research that Ukrainian researchers have produced be, let's quickly make copies of that research, get it off Ukrainian servers and copied out to servers outside of the country before a cruise missile hits the building and takes the servers out and the knowledge is lost permanently. Like, we need to protect, same thing with the cultural institutions. Churches in Ukraine right now are being destroyed. There was a famous site in Syria called Palmyra, which was wiped out by many would call terrorist groups. And before Palmyra was wiped clean by bombs, there was a team of Syrians that went in with digital scanners and with high resolution photographs, and they made all of those resources openly licensed. And there's a project called New Palmyra where you can go and see, at least digitally, what it was, because today it's gone, right? And many of the museums, they're doing their best to get cultural artifacts out of Ukraine right now, but that's tremendously difficult. And so there are people that are trying to record those and upload them to the internet with Creative Commons licenses on them so that the world can have access to them if they get destroyed. And so, war destroys things. And part of our collective job is to the extent we can save knowledge and we can save culture digitally, we ought try to do that.
Fabulous, thank you. Very scary and very sad. Dr. Chong has a question for you.
Me too.
Hi, Dr. Cable. I would like to ask, in my university, we have a programs to have the educator and learner to create the OER. But when we gather the material, we're having issues where some of the material may have using the copyright resources or materials. So to check whether all the material used in the OER or claimed as OER are actually free from any copyright issues, like any copyright infringement. So do you have any advice, because it is quite a tedious task for our unit to screen through the copyrights from the OER materials. So do you have any advice on that? Thanks.
So let me make sure I understand. Are you saying that when you get something that's OER that has a CC license on it, or it's in the public domain, that you go and do a check to make sure that the resources aren't actually all rights reserved copyright? Is that what you're asking? Or are you asking, like, you have some all rights reserved copyright and some OER that are mixed together?
We have educators and students to create on OER materials, but although we already emphasize on to use the CC open license materials, but some of them might not aware of this. They might accidentally use the copyright materials. For example, they create the videos. When we upload to our servers, the YouTube issue us a warning saying that you are using copyrighted materials and so on. But for video, it's quite easy. If we share on through the platforms, they will issue us the checkings, the warning. But for the others, like returns one, it's quite difficult for the university to check, all the materials made by the educator and students are free of any copyright issues.
Yeah, so that's a really good point, right? We want our goal in open education, well, just with open education resources, is we want to create, share, and reuse others' OER and be comfortable and certain that we have the legal rights that we think we do, so that we can use the works in the way that we want to use them. The first thing I would recommend is some training, some awareness raising. And so if you gave an example of some students when they're contributing materials to a course or a degree, that they're bringing in copyrighted, all rights reserved copyrighted works and putting them in, thinking that, oh, it's free and so it's okay to do that, but in fact it's a copyright violation. So the first thing you want to do there is you want to train them or teach them that that's not okay, right? That they can't do that. And so, that's okay. It's easy to do. That's what we do as well. We're happy to come in and train your folks, or we can. I wouldn't recommend that though. What I would recommend is you have a few people from your institution take the Creative Commons certificate, and then you do the training, right? I should also say all of the curriculum that makes up our Creative Commons certificate is also openly licensed. So you could get trained yourself in the CC certificate, and then you can take all of the content and use it, or use parts of it however you want to train others. So people don't know what they don't know, and so your students probably don't know. You need to set up a mechanism to train them. Generally speaking, so let me say it this way: it's very rare that Creative Commons ever sees something that has a Creative Commons license on it that isn't actually Creative Commons licensed. So when you see something that has a CC license on it, you should feel fairly confident that it is openly licensed. We just don't see very often, Cable Green takes an all rights reserved Pearson or McGraw-Hill textbook and I put a CC license on it and put it up on the web. Like, people just don't do that. I mean, first of all, it's not my right. It would be unethical for me to do that. But it's also illegal, right? Like, I don't have the legal rights to do it, and I could be sued if I did that. And so we don't see it very often. And so, 9 times out of 10, if you're training your students to look for works that are CC licensed, go to open repositories that have CC licensed works or public domain works, you're probably pretty safe. The other thing that's really important is to mark works. And let me share a link here with you. We have a wiki about this called marking. So here's the link for that. And by marking a work, what that really means is you're like putting a stamp on it. You're putting a label on a work that says this work is CC licensed. And so you do that for 2 reasons. Either and you'll see 2 links on this page, either you're marking your work with a CC license, or you're providing attribution to somebody else's work that you're using. So if you own it, you're saying, I put a CC license on this, and here's the mark. And the mark is usually title, author, source, license. So what's the title of the work? Who's the author? Who should get credit? What's the source? What's the URL for the work? And what's the license? Which Creative Commons license, and a link to the license. So that's it. It's that simple. And then same thing with attribution. If Diane shares a work with me, I need to give her credit. She put a CC license on it. So I would say this work, title by Diane Chambers, here's the link to it, and it's under this CC license. And so you also teach that to your students and your instructional designers and anybody that's building courses. And if they have those 2 skills, you're probably okay. Is that helpful?
Yes, very indeed. Thank you. Manira, I'll come back to you. I've just got a question in the chat. So somebody would like your ideas on this open access publication practices. In lots of journals, academics have to pay quite a lot to have their research published as open access. So how does this align with OER?
Yes, so I'll answer that. Let me first drop a link in. I saw go by in the chat earlier. Somebody said, hey, how do I join the Creative Commons network?
Yes.
And will you vouch for me? So yes, I will vouch for you. And if you need somebody else to vouch for you, I can get somebody else to as well. So you all are welcome to join the CC Global Network. We do have a team in Malaysia. We have a country chapter in Malaysia, and we'd love to have more people come in. It's free to join. There's no cost. and you're all very welcome. Back to the question about open access articles. So there are many different types of open access. You've probably heard some of these terms. There's green open access, there's gold open access, there's diamond open access. The basic idea of open access is free access to the article and the data, and that you can read it, right? You can actually read the article without paying for it. So that's kind of a very basic idea. And then it gets more complex from there. So one of the, you saw in my slides, when we talk about open access and what we advocate for at Creative Commons is CC BY on the article for a license. The reason for that is not because I want to take Diane's article and modify her article. That's not why I need an open license. I need an open license because I'm not just analyzing Diane's article. I'm analyzing 100,000 other articles that are like Diane's. And I told my computer program to do a pattern analysis and keyword search on 100,000 articles, and then to bring me back a report. And when my computer program does that, I just made derivative works of 100,000 articles. And if I don't have the legal rights to do that, I just copyright infringed 100,000 times. And at $25,000 per infraction, that can get very expensive. And so it's really important that the article is openly licensed. I also want to take all of those data sets and start to run different regression analyses on them in a meta-analysis for my paper that I'm writing. And if I don't have access to the data sets, technical access, open file format access, and it's got to be in the public domain, I can't do it. I can't do my research. And so, you know, we need that openness. And we also need zero embargo period. So one of the faults of my own national government here in the United States is my national government says if research is publicly funded by the US government, it must be open and freely available to the public, but 12 months after publication date. And so the COVID research that is being published tomorrow in the United States will be available in 2023. Does that do me any good when it comes to the COVID research that's going to be published tomorrow? Not unless I want to pay $50 or $60 to access the article, which is insane because I paid for the article. It was my taxpayer money that helped to fund the article, right? So like my government has some work to do on open access policies as well. Okay, back to the question. Why do people have to pay a lot of money to get their article published in what's called gold open access? Those are called article processing charges, or APCs. What the big journal publishers are trying to do, they understand that open access is here and that more of it is coming, right? Because how can you argue against the public should have access to scientific knowledge, right? To me, that's just an obvious argument all on its own. But then you add in, you know, the Australian people should have open access to the articles that the Australian people paid for. How do you argue with that, right? And the Malaysian people that paid money to their federal government and then their national government funded research, of course they should have access to it. And so should everybody else on the planet, right? Because why not? The whole point of science is to advance knowledge, understand humanity better, understand our world and our universe and our place in it. That's the whole point. And how can we do that if we can't read the research? How can we learn about these things if we can't get access to the educational resources? And so the publishers know this is coming. So what the publishers are trying to do is they're trying to switch the financial model. They want to make the billions of dollars that they're making now, but they just want to make it in a different way. So they know that they have to do open access, but they still want to make all the money. And the way that they're doing that is they're saying, okay, you want open access? Publisher or researcher X from University of Malaysia, you have to pay us $3,000 US to publish your article. And then we will put a Creative Commons license on your article and make it available. And so that's why, I mean, to be totally honest, that's why you have to pay those high fees, is they're just trying to flip the model. Our response to that is no, we need to stop that. That's a terrible model. If you think about what, I mean, just think about what the publishers do today. So the government's excuse me, the governments, for the most part, pay for the research in the world. So my government pays for a lot of the research. Your government pays for a lot of the research. The European Union, the Canadians, the Brazilians, the Chinese, the governments pay for the research on the planet, right? Then who does the research? Well, it's for the most part the faculty at the big public universities all around the world. So who pays their salaries? The public, or at least the public pays for a lot of their salary or part of their salary. Okay, so the public's now paid twice. Who does the peer review of the research? Other researchers, right? Diane's like, I do peer review. Diane, do you get paid when you peer review articles? No, she doesn't get paid. That's an expectation of being part of the academy and being in a field, is you peer review each other's work, right? So did the publishers pay for the research to be done? Did they give the research grant? No. Did they pay for the peer review? No. Now what do they get? So now Diane wants to publish. She contacts the journal that she wants to publish in. She said, I did this research. You know what the journal says to Diane? The journal says, in order for us to consider you, you have to sign these documents which give up copyright, and we get the copyright so we can publish, right? And so Diane signs her copyright over. So now they own the publicly funded peer-reviewed research. And then Diane gets published probably 2 years later, but she's really happy because Diane's trying to get promotion and tenure at her university. And now her university librarian says to Diane, Diane, I'm really sorry, but we had budget cuts this year and I had to cut the journal from our budget that you published to. And so now it's illegal for Diane under Australian copy law to use her own article that the Australian government funded. It's illegal for her to use her own article in her own class with her own students. Okay, that's the system. That's the system that we have today. That's insane. And is that the publisher's fault? No, it's not their fault. That's our fault because we're stupid. I mean, we're really stupid, right? If we're going to put up with that. And so what else should we do? Well, it's actually very simple. We should tell our governments publicly funded research, publicly funded educational resources need to be openly licensed. Okay, so government, put that in policy, put it in law, require us, the grantees, to openly license what we build for research, data, science, educational resources. And we'll do it. Okay, step one. Step two, where are the journals gonna be? If we're not gonna pay Elsevier billions of dollars anymore, who's gonna host the journals? We can host the journals. We already write all the research. We already do all the peer review, right? Let's look at the University of Malaysia. What are your best academic programs? Maybe the University of Malaysia has one of the best academic programs in biology in the world. Let them host 2 biology journals. Maybe the University of Perth in Australia has one of the best psychology programs in the world. Let them host 2 journals in psychology, right?
We
Maybe
actually
Yale
do.
University, which you do, right?
We actually do.
So,
we host 2 journals, so, and they're free.
And universities already have university presses. They know how to do this. And so do we need to pay large article processing fees? No. Why do we continue to do this stupid activity? Because of inertia, because it's the way we've always done it. It's status quo. When our faculty go to promotion and tenure committees, the deans and the department chairs are telling our faculty, oh, you must publish in one of these prestigious journals or you can't get tenure. Well, what is a prestigious journal? It's a name, right? What if the prestigious journal for psychology was at the University of Perth? That maybe there was still an article processing charge to help them fund their operations, or maybe we don't even need those anymore because governments are funding the APCs that our faculty are paying one way or another to get open access. What if the governments just give a little bit of extra money to the universities to host journals and we're done with it? And we share all the science that we produce, right? This is not rocket science. We can do this.
Fabulous. And I must say, I've never once paid for a publication. I refuse to. I think it's immoral. Anyway, let's go to Manira, who has a question for you.
Okay, thank you, Diane, Prof. Fong, and also, Prof. Cable. Actually, I have understood from this session about ethical issues, protection, and also impact. And interestingly, I have 3 questions, which is perhaps part of question 1 already answered. But the question goes, how to balance, how to have both balance as academician with credential and also as an activist with as digital contributor, because we also always have the dilemma. I mean, perhaps not so how do I say? I mean, like how to decide either what to make it copyright free or not for books or journal articles. That's my first question. And my second question concern about the disability friendly digital in terms of open access, because sometimes even though it's already open access, but it's still in terms of disability accessibility is still not there. And how about my final question, the third question is about POD, print on demand, because sometimes the terms is quite vague and people also can somehow distribute or do something not proper on that. Thank you.
Those are good questions. So on the first one, if I understood your question right, did you mean the balance between sharing some work under open licenses versus maybe selling some other work or publishing work?
And also do write up on that. I mean, like publications, because for example, like this, I'm from political science. As you said, if the copyright defeat the purpose, because after 20 years, so for example, now we are having about election and so on, about voting, election, but after 20 years, perhaps it's already a norm, right? So how to make it, I mean, for example, in our experience, if we want to join competition, we have to have the copyright license, right, for our product and so on. But at the same time, we also want to do our social responsibility to share. So how to balance this? We sort of like trapped in this dilemma.
Okay, thank you. That's very clear. Well, so the first thing I would say is that it's okay to share some of your work and not share other work. That's okay, right? So if you look at your portfolio of work and say, this is work I want to openly license, and this is work that I'm writing a novel that I want to sell and make a bunch of money and retire, that's okay. Like, you can do some and not all. The second thing, just to clarify, you don't give up your copyright when you openly license. So if you said, you might be joining a competition where you have to have the copyright to your work. By putting a Creative Commons license on your work, you're not giving up copyright. You're keeping your copyright and you're adding a license that shares some freedoms and permissions with the public. So there's no problem there. The other thing I would say, and this kind of goes with sharing some of your work, but not all of your work, some people share their work after a period of time. So, you might say, well, I'm a little bit nervous about sharing work that maybe it's the first draft, or it's a preprint, or it's maybe the first time I've taught it, and I'm just a little nervous about sharing yet. And I'd like to maybe teach it for a couple of semesters to make sure that it's quote unquote good enough to share with somebody else. And some people just feel very strongly that way, and that's okay, right? You just share when you're ready to share. I will say, however, that it's becoming more common to share preprints and early ideas, because everybody knows that, hey, that's where we all start, right? Like, nobody starts with a finished perfect copy. We all start with an idea, and that it's okay to share any point along that line. So that's the first one. Second one, about open access and accessibility. I know Diane's going to go more into this, so I'll keep this very short. In general, with accessibility, we care about a lot of things with open educational resources. We care about the design of the works, and Diane, I'm sure, will go into a lot of detail about alt tags for images and being careful about how you use colors. Like, you don't want to use red and green to show information because if somebody's colorblind.
Going through all of that next. Good.
So there's a lot of information there. With open educational resources, we also want to think about portability. So how can it be moved from here to there? And sometimes there is offline. So, have you designed the OER so that it only works in your online platform? That's okay if that's what you are able to share. But, can you be thoughtful about also, will this work equally well offline? Or will this work equally well if it's printed? So it's just something to consider about downstream. you want to think really hard about the license. So you've heard me talk about the licenses, and I showed that continuum of most free to least free. You want to be as high as you possibly can on that list. So, if you can go CC BY, use CC BY, because what you're giving to everybody else is more flexibility. Let me share one link with you quickly. We call this the CC Remix chart. And I'll share, here's the link. And if you look at this chart, you'll see all the licenses in the public domain tools lined up in columns and rows. Every place where there's a green check, you can remix 2 different licenses together. And every place where there's a black X, you cannot remix them together. And so in education, we want to avoid those black X's, because that means somebody can't take a piece of this and a piece of this and mash it together and make something new. Well, we want educators to be able to do that. And so there's always this balance between, oh, am I fearful that a publisher might take my work and make commercial use, which, by the way, doesn't really happen very often. But am I so scared about that I'm going to put an NC work? But then when I look at this chart, I can see that NC causes me a lot of black X's. So is it worth it? Is the trade-off worth it? And then your last question about print on demand. As I would argue, this is also an accessibility issue. For people that don't have access to digital devices or to digital or to internet or bandwidth, then yes, having print is very important. There are also a lot of students just like print, like they like to take their pen. I mean, as we were working together, I'm using print on my desk, and some people just like to write and read and, not look at a digital device all the time. And so as you're, not only as you're designing, but as you're deploying and launching OER, yes, you want to think about, if a student wants to get a printed copy, where can they do so? And oftentimes in higher education, we will work with the college bookstore, and we'll print a copy of the OER at a very low cost, and we'll make it available in the college bookstore. And then we'll make it, it's available at cost. So we're not making a profit on it. We're just making that option available to the students if they want a printed copy.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Have we got any other questions? Not at the moment. So my goodness, thank you for all the information that you have provided and for your fantastic responses to the questions. Much appreciated. We might let you go to bed, or at least go and have some dinner or whatever you need to do at this time of night. And really appreciate your contribution. So thank you once again. A round of applause, please, for Dr. Green.
Thank you all, and thank you for the kind invitation to join you. I wish you a good evening and have fun with accessibility.
Thank you very much.